live in this very unpredictable world. I mean, right now the Middle East is burning, but Europe faces this, Russia, which is, it's an aggressive Russia that wants to expand. The common understanding across Europe is if Russia isn't stopped in Ukraine, it will look to spread its influence further into Europe as it wants to redress the security balance after the Cold War. We've got an economically aggressive China, and we have an increasingly unpredictable best friend abroad, the United States. And so, Europe is contending with all of that.
Can we just briefly, and we should explain, we're talking on Monday, which of the major European powers is closest to Trump as we speak? Has Giorgia Meloni assumed the role of Europe's chief Trump whisperer, would you say?
Well, there are a number vying for that role, aren't there? I mean, the Prime Minister thought he had the role. Giorgia Meloni, definitely, she's among very few European leaders to have a truly warm relationship with Donald Trump. She was also very close to Elon Musk as well. You've obviously got Viktor Orban in Hungary. I think amongst those four, definitely Italy with the closest relationship. And I think, while we're looking at things going on in Iran, you can see that Friedrich Merz, though, the German chancellor, is also vying to have sort of a seat close to Donald Trump. And I think when we talk now about European powers needing to work better together, Iran is a really good example, Jane, of where this often stumbles, because at the end of the day, it's each country for themselves, and sometimes each government or each politician for themselves, where they act in what they think is their best interest. And I think if you have a look at Germany and Spain when it comes to Iran, that you really see this in sharp relief. So Friedrich Merz was straight out there after the initial attacks on Iran, the Israeli and American attacks, saying, there's no point criticizing our allies at times like this, and there's little use really in looking at international law. Whereas Spain's Prime Minister, Sanchez, said this is definitely outside international law, and he was extremely outspoken. When Donald Trump last week hit back at Spain and said he wanted to slap a massive trade embargo at Spain to punish it for what it was saying about the attacks on Iran, and also the fact that Spain said that the US could not use military bases in Spain to launch attacks on Iran from, who was sitting next to Donald Trump? It was Friedrich Merz of Germany. And did he say anything to support his European ally? He said not a word. Now, you can have a look at why Friedrich Merz might have done that. He wants to be close to Donald Trump. He's looking at his spluttering economy, like all major economies in Europe. The German economy, once the powerhouse, is now really, really struggling. Those exports that Germany relies on are very energy hungry. We're looking at cars, we're looking at the chemical industry. And since Germany has lost access to cheap Russian energy because of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the sanctions, it now relies for 96% of its access to liquefied natural gas, LNG, on the United States. And the United States is Germany's second largest trade partner. So you can see why Friedrich Merz might have kept silent, but it does not do very much for an image of European unity that Europe says is important.
So I completely appreciate what you're saying about Germany. Why do the Spanish feel free, if you like, to take their stance then?
So Spain relies less on the United States for trade, and Pedro Sanchez at home is extremely unpopular. He rises in opinion polls when he stands up against Donald Trump, which he's done on a number of occasions. He was very outspoken over the war in Gaza, but particularly with Donald Trump, when Donald Trump, and of course he's not the first US president to do so, pressed European allies, insisted that they spend more on their own defense. And that was signed off at a NATO summit last summer. The only country to say no was Spain. And that played very well at home. Also, I mean, and these things can be true at the same time. There may be cynical political reasons why Spain's taking this stance, but also Pedro Sanchez believes in this. He believes that the attacks on Iran right now were outside of international law. He does believe, he says, in an international rule-based order, which he thinks is being eroded. Those two things can be true at the same time.
Right, and interestingly, in the first of these documentaries you've made, you're in Italy, and you've pointed out that Meloni personally has a good relationship with Donald Trump, but I was really interested in the part of the documentary that showed that the Italian public, quite a chunk, really mistrusts the USA, don't they? And they've never really liked American influence very much.
They've been very US skeptic, and I think what's interesting to know, what I show in the documentary, is there is a section in Italy that's very sympathetic to the Russian narrative as well, which is something quite separate. You may not know that during the Cold War, for example, Italy's Communist Party was the biggest in Western Europe. And there was very long time, a lot of skepticism about NATO. And also, I think what I show in the documentary is that Italians just don't trust the states. They don't trust the government as a force. And this goes back centuries in Italy. It's still quite a young country. And in the years, the hundreds of years before it became independent in the 1860s, Italy was permanently, well, the country that is now Italy, parts of it were permanently being conquered by one power over another. And so Italians learned to trust the very, very few. So when it comes to the war in Ukraine, for example, straight after that full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we've now marked the 4-year anniversary of that just now. Italy stood out as the only Western country where the majority of Italians didn't want to send weapons to help Ukraine. And now, 4 years later, it's only 15% of Italians that want anyone in Europe or the United States to send weapons to Ukraine. Not because they don't care about Ukrainians, they say, but because they don't trust their state, their government, to protect them from any knock-on effects, whether it's rising energy prices or any kind of reprisals from Russia. So that's really what this series is about. It's just understanding where attitudes come from.
Right. I mean, it really is. It's a fascinating glimpse. And Germany is a country that I'm afraid it's still true, isn't it? That in this country we associate Germany with only one thing. And actually, it's a country that Britain or British visitors used to flock to because it is beautiful. There's so much to see there and so much to do. But I was really, really startled by how the crumbling infrastructure that you show, those broken bridges. Germany appears to be falling apart.
I think Germany's been going through a sort of an identity crisis that is symbolized in those crumbling bridges. There's thousands of them that have been sort of closed down because they need repairs. The whole German system that it got so famous for, Germany being so efficient and German economy roaring on behalf of all of Europe, really is how it was traditionally seen. But it relied very much on the outside world. So it relied on selling to China, selling to the United States, having its security guaranteed by the United States, and running on cheap energy from Russia. And each one of those things it can no longer rely on. That's caused a crisis in its industry and its economy. And what was then revealed was actually there was a whole load of crumbling infrastructure. I mean, also, it has this shiny, efficient image, Germany, but I can't get over every time I go there how people still use faxes in Germany. Never mind the fact that your mobile phone often can't get reception there. And then there's the state of the road. So under Angela Merkel, for example, who was prime minister for 16 years, there was so little internal investment in Germany. It was not a country that invested in its own infrastructure. And that's really come home to roost. Also, when you want to help Ukraine, Jane, because if you think about it, if you want to use traditional armory, and there has been, especially at the beginning of the war, bigger reliance on tanks and sort of traditional machinery. You have to be able to move that across Europe, and Germany is a big artery there. But if its roads and its bridges aren't up to the task, I mean, this says something about the country itself. So now you have a government that says, right, we are now going to invest big time in our defense and in our infrastructure. And by 2029, NATO says that Germany wants to spend more on its defense. than France and the United Kingdom put together. It wants to build the biggest conventional army. I think it's interesting, as you say, Germany, often people only think of one thing, and I think you're referring to the Second World War there. But 80 years after that, the fact that Germany wants to build the biggest conventional army, and now that it's so rooted in the EU and so rooted in NATO, actually that's looked at with relief by its European allies and neighbours rather than with apprehension.
And what about Brexit? I mean, does anybody care? Does anybody mention us? What do they think of the UK?
So it's not that people don't care. They care, and Europeans would still rather we were in than out. But the rancor, the bitterness, everything that I covered as Europe editor during the negotiations, it's just evaporated. The idea of us joining, or the conversation thought of us joining, rejoining, is something you only hear of here in the UK. It's not something that's discussed in European circles. What they do is they look at us now with a lot of warmth, a lot of respect. I think Russia's full-scale invasion 4 years ago made a massive effect. The fact that the UK took a leading role, the fact that the UK wants to work together more when it comes to energy security, when it comes to more conventional security, that is absolutely welcomed. And because we live in this very unpredictable world, I mean, right now the Middle East is burning, but Europe faces this, Russia, which is, it's an aggressive Russia that wants to expand. The common understanding across Europe is if Russia isn't stopped in Ukraine, it will look to spread its influence further into Europe as it wants to redress the security balance after the Cold War. We've got an economically aggressive China, and we have an increasingly unpredictable best friend abroad, the United States. And so, Europe is contending with all of that. So it makes sense that the powers in Europe want to work together. And what the EU is realizing more and more is that it is absolutely impossible on the world stage to get 27 countries all agreeing when it comes to foreign policy or even security and defense. So we're seeing more and more kind of ad hoc groups of, coalitions of the willing, if you like. I mean, there is the labeled coalition of the willing on Ukraine, of course, which is led by the UK and France. Then there's smaller groupings like the UK and Norway when it comes to wanting to track, Russian subs. And then you have the Baltic states, the Nordic states with Canada, which is almost becoming a glorified European country, looking at safeguarding their parts of the world, and they feel that they share common values, and more cooperation with so-called like-minded allies, Japan, South Korea, Australia. So you're seeing much more of a mix of different groupings when it comes to self-interest. So these are really interesting as well as threatening times. But as I say with this documentary, we try not to clobber anyone over the head of it. This is a softer glide through the big four next door and just understanding a little bit where we can rely on them more and sometimes less.
Katya, I know you are based in Brussels. If you had to pick another of these European locations as your base, which one would you go for in terms of prosperity, a sense of happiness, a sense of optimism?
Oh, Jane, that's really, really, really hard. That's like putting lots of really good cakes in front of me and asking me to choose and what I would normally do. And I feel we might be sisters in this. I would ask for one spoon, multiple plates, and take a bit out of each one. And that is how I feel about these countries and others in Europe. I really feel this is an incredible continent. Whether it comes to natural beauty, food, culture, history, but also the fact that we do. I mean, we live in very cynical times, and but things are never black and white. Basically, European countries tend to share certain values about humanity, and the rules that we would like to live by. And I believe that still exists today. And I think again that's why Europe on the edge sounds hard, but what we do is nothing against them, but we don't talk to politicians and we don't talk to journalists either. This is about the humanity of Europe and understanding the humans who live next door. And I think it's really important in these times that we don't lose our humanity or our trust in humans wherever they live in the world, and however they are touched by these events, without wanting to sound too moralizing.
Well,
That sounds a bit dreadful, doesn't it?
I'm going to write down that your answer to that question was Spain. Okay, thank you.
That's not true.
No, that was really interesting, Katya. Thank you so much. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for having me.